from the conference on the hidden agenda behind education reform, outcome-based education. Sponsored by both WVNE Radio and by the Concerned Women for America. Held at Triumphant Life Christian Center, Worcester, Massachusetts. This is the general session by Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. Samuel Blumenfeld speaks on the subject, The Dumbing Down of America's Children. Presentation for Saturday afternoon, May 7th, 1994.
WA conference in Massachusetts. I guess this is a first. And there are many firsts now occurring in Massachusetts. Apparently the natives are getting restless, which is a good sign, because the only way we're going to stop this juggernaut, this one world, new world order juggernaut, is for parents to rise up, because you must understand that they will never be able to accomplish their goals without your children. You see? So you have the ultimate power. You have the ultimate power. And I always tell parents that if you want educational reform, you can have it tomorrow. You know how? By taking your kids out of the schools and educating them at home. You've got instant education reform, or as Bill Clinton would say, Shazam. In any case, I did want to say something about some of the books I've written, so that you might find them of interest to you and also helpful in your getting to know more about what's been happening. One of the earliest books I wrote is entitled The New Illiterates, and I got involved in this whole reading problem quite by happenstance. I was an editor at Grosset and Dunlap in New York City, a publishing company that publishes the Nancy Drew and that sort of wonderful stuff. And a friend of mine by the name of Watson Washburn came to my office one day, and he asked me if I would become a member of his newly founded organization called the Reading Reform Foundation. So I asked him, I said, well, what's the purpose of the Reading Reform Foundation? He said, well, it's to get phonics back in the schools. Now, this was 1963. And I said, what do you mean get phonics back in the schools? Since when was it taken out? And he told me that in the early 1930s, professors of education had changed the way reading is taught in American schools. They threw out the alphabetic phonics method, and they put in this look, say, whole word, or sight method that teaches children to read English as if it were Chinese. And I told him, I said, that's impossible. You can't learn to read that way. It's ridiculous. It's stupid. It doesn't make sense. It goes totally against everything that our alphabetic system is about. And so he suggested that I read Rudolf Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read, which was published in 1955. And lo and behold, Dr. Flesch explained it all very nicely. And so I became a convert, because I realized that you can't learn to read unless you're a phonetic reader. But I was also very curious as to who ever thought up that idea. I mean, how did people with PhDs ever think up something quite so ridiculous? And so I did a good deal of research, and I found out that the originator of the whole word method was none other than the Reverend Thomas H. Gallaudet, the teacher of the deaf and dumb. You see, if you're deaf and dumb, you don't hear sounds, and so you teach children to read by little pictures and whole words. Now, they thought that they could adapt this method for normal children, and they did use it. He produced a primer called the Mother's Primer, and this primer was first used in the primary schools of Massachusetts in 1837. By 1844, the results were so disastrous that the educators in the upper grades said, this has got to go. You know, this whole word business is terrible. And so they wrote a critique that was written in 1844. The first critique of the whole word method was actually written in 1844, and I reprinted it in this book because I wanted the reader to know how far back this problem went and how it was solved. They knew it didn't work then. Well, it was brought back in the early part of this century by our progressive educators, all of whom were socialists, and who were determined to change America into a socialist society. Now, this preceded the Russian Revolution. This was in the 1890s. And where these gentlemen got their inspiration, John Dewey and the rest of them, they got their inspiration not from Karl Marx, but from an American writer by the name of Edward Bellamy, who wrote a book entitled Looking Backward. And in that book, Bellamy projected a fantasy of a socialist America in the year 2000. A socialist America in the year 2000. And it all takes place in Boston. You see. And so if you want to know what was their inspiration, read that book. It's still in print. It's considered one of the most important books in American history as far as ideas are concerned. Anyway, it was John Dewey who decided that the real obstacle to socialism in this country was high literacy. Because high literacy produced people who could stand on their own 2 feet and think for themselves. They did not need the group. They did not need group learning. They did not need the collective. And he said that high literacy was very asocial because good readers could curl up in a corner with a book and not care what was going on around them. They weren't interested in doing group think and group activity. In other words, so high literacy had to go. Now, they wondered, how are we going to do this? How are we going to reduce the literacy level of the American people? How are we going to dumb down the American people? They said, Eureka, we've got it. We'll take this method that was used back in the 1830s and produced excellent results, you see, and we'll bring it back and we'll modernize it. And lo and behold, we had the look-say readers, which the most extensive series came out in the early 30s, and most of you were taught by that method, the Dick and Jane books or the Gates Macmillan readers. Now, the interesting thing about Dick and Jane is this. In Gallaudet's Primer, published in 1837, the first sentence reads, Frank had a dog. Its name was Spot. And then in 1930, all of a sudden, we have See Spot Run. So there we are, back to Spot. Resurrected. Spot was resurrected. In any case, I did a line-by-line study of the Dick and Jane reading program. I analyzed it line by line and came to the conclusion that any child taught to read by that method exclusively would exhibit the symptoms of dyslexia. Now, the interesting thing is that there were many of the older teachers who were forced to use the Dick and Jane books because they already threw out the phonics books. But the older teachers knew enough phonics so that they could teach a lot of the kids who were using the Dick and Jane books, they could teach them the phonics. And sometimes they had to do it behind closed doors, and we call that form of phonics bootleg phonics, which was quite prevalent during the 30s and 40s when you still had the old teachers. But as the older teachers died off and the new teachers came in, teachers who knew not phonics, you see, and were stuck in this whole word business, the literacy levels of the American people began to decline considerably. Now, incidentally, these people, the progressives, did studies very early in this century to see how did children learn to read by this look-say method. And they came to the conclusions that they would not learn very well. In fact, they found out through their own studies that defective children read the way look-say readers read. That defective children make the same errors, even though they've been taught to read by a phonetic method. This was, they found this out in a study that was made in Chicago, whereby they taught a group of defective children to read by phonics and a group of normal children to read by phonics. The normal children did very well. They could read anything. But the defective children had a terrible time learning to read by phonics. In fact, they made the same kind of errors that look-say readers make. For example, they would use word substitution. If the word said horse, they'd say pony, if they couldn't think of it, because their first instinct was to look at the word as a whole. to see a picture, you see. Now, we are training normal children to read like defective children. And this is official policy in every whole language classroom, where they tell children to skip words, guess words, substitute words, do anything but read accurately. And the thing is, when you train children to read that way, they develop what is known as a holistic reflex. Now, what is a holistic reflex? It's automatically looking at words as whole configurations, looking at them as pictures, as Chinese ideographs. In other words, because these children have been deprived of phonetic knowledge, they really cannot look at those words phonetically. They have been taught to look at them as little pictures. They're taught to memorize the words as sight words. You all have heard of sight word, but a sight word. Well, a sight word by definition is learning to look at a word without knowing that the letters stand for anything, without knowing that the letters have any meaning at all. And so if you become a holistic reader with a holistic reflex, you automatically develop a blockage against seeing words phonetically. Because in order to become a proficient reader, you must develop a phonetic reflex. What's a phonetic reflex? A phonetic reflex is automatically associating letters with sounds. And how do we do that if you teach a child to read by intensive systematic phonics? Well, the first thing you do is teach a child to recognize the letters of the alphabet. Then the second thing you do is teach the child the sounds that the letters stand for, and you drill the child in the letter sounds until the child develops an automatic ability to associate letters with sounds. Now, in the old days, that was done very simply. What they would do is, first they would teach the child the sounds of the letters, and then they would drill the children in the consonant-vowel combinations, such as bay, bee, bi, bo, bu, may, me, my, mo, mu. I don't know how many of you have seen some of these old primers where they had these rows and rows of these combinations. The children were drilled in them, ab, eb, ib, ab, ub, am, em, im, am. The purpose, of course, was to help the child develop this automatic association, and once they had that, they had the phonetic reflex, and they became proficient readers. That's why there was no such thing as dyslexia back in the old days. When I was going to school, there was no remedial reading. There were no dyslexics. Just shows you how old I am. I entered the first grade in 1931. The Dick and Jane books were available, but the schools of New York City, this was a depression. They couldn't afford the new books. So I was saved by the depression. My literacy was saved by the depression. But the rich kids, they got the look saved before anybody else, you know. And in fact, you would say, to show you how even the richest were affected, John D. Rockefeller Jr. donated $3 million to the Lincoln School at the Teachers College in New York City, Teachers College at Columbia University, where they were doing all this experimentation. The Lincoln School was a progressive school, and he put 4 of his sons in that school, 3 of whom became functionally illiterate, became dyslexic. Nelson was a dyslexic, Lawrence was dyslexic, and Winthrop was dyslexic. As a matter of fact, Winthrop did so poorly that he had to drop out of college, believe it or not. This is a Rockefeller. He had to drop out of course, he became governor of Arkansas. Tells you something about Arkansas. In any case, the dumbing down proceeded on schedule, and it has worked so well. The dumbing down of American children has worked so well that just last September, dumbing down of the American people, because children grow into adults. Last September, our Secretary of Education, Mr. Riley, announced the results of a survey, a $12 million survey of adult literacy in the United States, which informed us that 50% of the adults in this country read so poorly that for all practical purposes you might as well consider them functionally illiterate. 50%. Now, that's good news or bad news depending on what your aim is, what your goal is. If your goal is to dumb down the nation, they must be congratulating themselves. They must say, gee, this thing works like magic. Look what we've been able to accomplish in a free country that has compulsory school attendance. Kids are spending more years in school than ever before. Teachers are paid more than ever before. They've got more books than ever before, and yet they're getting dumber. We're getting higher illiteracy rates because that's what all of this is intended to do. And to give you an idea of how this has affected even the top students in America, let me just cite you a very simple statistic. You know the SATs. Who takes the SATs? Kids who are going to go to college. So that's the creme de la creme, right? This score does not deal with the kids who drop out, who have no intention of going to college. Most of them are already functionally illiterate, so they're discounted. But now we're talking about the creme de la creme. Now, the highest score that you can possibly get on the SAT is between 750 and 800. 750 and 800. That's the tops. And in 1972, the number of students who achieved that score was 2,817. In 1990, that number was down to 1,226. In other words, this nation is literally losing its brains. Now, if you go down to the very bottom score, which is 200 to 249, and incidentally, they say that you can get 200 by just signing your name. In 1972, the number of students who got that lowest score was 71,084. In 1987, it was up to 123,470. So you can see what's happening. The dumb are getting dumber, and the smart are getting dumber. And this dumbing down process, as I say, works throughout the entire structure of the country. And the reason why they're dumbing us down, of course, is to soften us up for being part of the New World Order, for being led into this new system, this international system. And it's all international. Incidentally, all of the English-speaking countries and some of the European countries are experiencing the same decline in literacy. I've been to Australia, New Zealand. It exists there. They have a horrendous reading problem in Australia now. It's in England. I have friends in England who are trying to get phonics back in the schools there. It's a worldwide situation. So the dumbing down is on a worldwide basis. Why? Because we're headed toward a pyramidal type of society, a pyramidal type of world order. You will have at the very top what we call the university elite. The Hillarys and Billaries. These are the people who come out of the universities and they feel that they're born to rule. They're so smart. They're so intelligent. And they're going to impose their views on everybody else. Directly beneath them, you have the privileged managerial class, which includes also not only the CEOs and the scientists and the top educators, but also the artists and the writers and that sort of thing. And then directly below them, you have everybody else who are being systematically dumbed down and using the method that was described by Charlotte so well, by this job training idea, full employment idea. So you could see the pyramidal society is in the process of being constructed before our very eyes. And it's working wonders. Here's another interesting bit of information. This comes from an article from a column that was published in the Dallas Morning News in August of 1971. The title is "Young People Are Getting Dumber," and it's an interview done by the writer David Hawkins, an interview of a man by the name of John Gaston, who is the director of the Fort Worth branch of the Human Engineering Laboratory. And Mr. Gaston told Mr. Hawkins, he said, "Do you know that the present generation knows less than its parents? All of our laboratories around the country are recording a drop in vocabulary of 1% a year. 1% a year. In all our 50 years of testing, it's never happened before. Young people know fewer words than their fathers. That makes them know less. Can you imagine what a drop in knowledge of 1% a year for 30 years could do to our civilization? And that's what's been happening. Have you listened to young people, the extent of their vocabularies? What is it? Pizza, hot dog, McDonald's, maybe a few other, condom. That's got to be in their vocabulary. And, words like that, a lot of that sort of thing. That's their new vocabulary. That's the extent of vocabulary. Then he says, and a very interesting thing, he says, we also believe that the recent rise in violence correlates with the drop in vocabulary. That long testing has convinced us that crime and violence predominate among people who score low in vocabulary. If they can't express themselves with their tongues, they'll use their fists. Well, we've already seen that there's quite a correlation between functional illiteracy and delinquency. That is, when these kids become very, very frustrated in school because they're not able to learn to read, even though they're told that this is the holy grail that they've got to achieve, they become very, very frustrated. And that frustration in some kids leads to violence. As a matter of fact, if you recall what happened in Los Angeles last year, the rioting, which was basically, you might say, instigated by these young gangs in Los Angeles. What do you have in Los Angeles? These gangs. These people are functional illiterates, organized in gangs, because they can't get decent jobs. They can't make it in our high-tech economy. And so how are they going to make it? Stealing, drugs, violence, killing. And we've also found out that these young people who have this so-called attention deficit disorder, which is a result of what's going on in the schools, they have to live at a high, very intense emotional level. Now, how much more emotional and intense can you get than going around killing people or setting a whole community on fire? That's pretty intense. This becomes almost a need for them. It's almost an addiction. They have this addiction to this high-intensity lifestyle that they've got. That's why they don't want to do what the Koreans do. What do the Koreans do? They sit behind a counter for, 14 hours a day. That's not very exciting. It's not very exciting putting cans on shelves. It's not very exciting doing the normal things that human beings do to earn a living. It's much more exciting going around and shooting people, having these drive-by shootings and going to funerals and tearing your hair out over some horrible thing, drugging yourself up. And is it caused by illiteracy? Well, the frustration is caused by illiteracy. People talk a lot about ADD. As a matter of fact, the other day, I don't know how many of you have been listening to Rush Limbaugh, and he's had quite a bit of discussion about attention deficit disorder. Now, when I was going to school, there was no such thing as attention deficit disorder. You know why? Because all of us sat in desks that were bolted to the floor. I don't know, how many of you remember desks that were bolted to the floor? And you remember there were rows? You didn't move any desks around the room. You were facing in one direction. You were facing the teacher, and you had a direct relationship. The teacher was talking to everybody. Today, the kids are seated in little tables, facing one another, conversing, getting on each other's nerves. And the teacher is going around the room facilitating. She's a facilitator, you see. And she'll spend a little time with this one and a little time with that one, but she never spends any time with all of them except when they're in a circle and she's reading a story to them because they can't read themselves, you see. So that's what you have in today's schools. Now, that kind of atmosphere creates, an awful lot of disturbance, particularly when you're using a method of teaching reading that is totally contrary to the way the brain works. You see, remember, all of these children who enter school, or the vast majority of them, are normal kids. Normal hearing, normal eyesight, normal speech development. They've all taught themselves to speak their own language, all by themselves. So they are very good self-teachers. They understand the method of trial and error. They understand the logic of language because, as you know, children develop a grammar. They speak grammatically very early in life. So their brains are working very efficiently. So then they enter a school where everything is being done backwards, where everything is being done illogically, and this grates on the brain. You know what it's like when you put that metal on glass and you make that kind of, you know what it does? Even thinking about it sometimes makes your skin crawl. That's what happened to some of these kids because they know they want to keep their brains intact. You see, what is being done to them is the educators are performing a non-surgical prefrontal lobotomy. That's what they're doing. They want to dumb down these kids. They want to prevent that learning dynamo from proceeding in its normal way. You see, because these children are language learning dynamos at that early time in life, and their brains are working at a rate that it will never work again as an adult. When you realize that a little child teaches himself or herself to speak the language with all of its grammatical complexities and this incredible expansion of vocabulary that they achieve and by the time they're 6 years old, you know that brain is powerful. It's a powerful brain. What it lacks is knowledge, it lacks wisdom, and it lacks experience. But it's a powerful brain, and the educators have been working for years on means of controlling, on means of using this brain, on derailing it, derailing this learning process. And so they have produced these methods of teaching that throw monkey wrenches into the process. Now, what kind of defense do children have against that kind of an onslaught on their intelligence? What kind of defense? None. The only defense they have is physical. They act up. You see, in order to block out what's being done to them, they act up and they become attention deficit disorder. No wonder they don't want to pay attention. Because if they paid attention, they would be damaging their brains, you see. And so they turn it off. So how do the psychologists deal with this? They say, oh, well, we'll just drug the little animals, which is what they do. And Ritalin is now being used throughout the schools of America. And there are many parents who say, oh, it's doing wonderfully for my child, without realizing what the basic cause of this so-called attention deficit disorder. And you know that these children can pay attention to something that they're interested in. So they don't have some, inbred, lack of attention. It's they don't want to pay attention to something that's destroying them. Just as when I hear horrible heavy metal music, what do? I turn it off. It's on the air, I just turn it off. But supposing you were forced to listen to that stuff, how would you defend yourself? Supposing you were the prisoners of the New World Order, and they put you in a room and played this music day in and day out. It would drive you stark crazy. You would, it's a wonderful torture I've just invented, haven't I? You'd be driven stark raving mad. And you would try to put it out of your mind. You would try not to hear it. You would produce a kind of deafness in order to keep that out of your brain as a defense mechanism, you see. So I believe that ADD is largely a defense mechanism. Now, there may be children who indeed are much more rambunctious than others, and mothers who have been pregnant know that. They know that some kids kick. Some kids are rather active. Well, it depends on maybe what the mother's been doing. Maybe she's been horseback riding Or maybe she's a jogger and has been jogging all this time, all these years, and the poor little kid has been, been shaken up and down and is used to it. And so when he comes out of the womb, or he or she comes out of the womb, and you put the child in a crib with no movement, what happens? They shake it. I want some movement. You see. That's why they got rid of the cradle. You see. Who got rid of the cradle? Doctors did. You see. Scientists got rid of the cradle. They said that's coddling the kids. When a woman is carrying a child, she's walking, she's getting up, she's running, she's doing all kinds of things. The child feels that movement. The child knows that there's movement there. The child is not dead, you see. The child's alive. But, so you can see how a child can be born, quote, hyperactive, unquote. But then how do you deal with that? Well, I know a little girl who is hyperactive, but she's a fantastic young athlete. I mean, I saw her teach herself to swim. I could not believe what this young little girl of 4 years old was willing to do, to dive in and to go back in and back in until she was perfect in what she would do. Nobody had to teach her that. I could have never have done that. But she's able to, that's her personality. And why should you call that a disease? Why should you say that she's sick and needs a psychiatrist? No, what she needs is a bigger swimming pool. That's all. But in any case, that's how I got involved in this literacy problem. And in order to, it's one thing to tell parents what not to do, and to tell parents how awful the schools are. It's another thing to be able to offer them a cure or a remedy. And so after I wrote The New Illiterates, I wrote this book, How to Tutor, which tells a parent how to teach their child reading, writing, and arithmetic in the traditional manner. Phonetic reading, teach the child to read phonetically, teach the child to write cursively. Don't teach your child to print. It's a total waste of time. Teach your child cursive writing from the very beginning. That's the way I was taught. People ask me, well, how do you know that? Well, that's the way we were all taught. Is there anyone as old as I am around here? All right. I'm sure that lady back there remembers that you were taught cursive writing, weren't you? Yes. And that's why your grandparents have better handwriting than you do. Because they were all taught penmanship. And the reason why we were taught cursive writing in the first grade is because it's easier than print. It's easier. There are only 3 movements in all of cursive. There's the undercurve, the overcurve, and the up and down. That's all there is to cursive. And also, it helps you learn to read because the cursive letters are not as confusing as the ball and stick, where the B and the D look alike, and the G's and the P's look alike. Depends on which direction you put the ball, But in cursive writing, a B starts like an L, goes up like that, and a D starts like an A, so a child will never confuse the two. So we learned cursive and reading of print at the same time, and we did very well, and we had plenty of time in which to practice our cursive so that we developed a decent penmanship, which is not true today. Today what happens is the kids are taught ball and stick for the first 2 years or so, and then in the 3rd grade, they say, okay, we're going to switch to cursive. Well, in the 3rd grade, they're busy doing other things. They're learning all about apartheid in South Africa. They're learning all about, the environment. They're learning all about sex, how to use condoms. So the teacher doesn't have the time to help the children develop a good cursive script. You can't supervise it for them. They're not going to take the time to start writing slowly again as if they were in the 1st grade, because now they've got to write all these important compositions. So they do everything backwards, you see. And in math now, it's the same thing. So I teach cursive here. Now in math, they're doing the same thing. Everything is backwards. They say you got to teach the concept first before you can teach math. And then they say, oh, and by the way, kids no longer have to memorize anything. No more rote learning. No more memorizing the arithmetic facts because we have these little calculators and they can use the calculator. Well, how will they know they've made a mistake if it isn't up here? You see, our arithmetic system is a counting system that uses 10 abstract symbols with which to do everything. Everything with just 10 symbols. It's a memory system. If you don't memorize the arithmetic facts, you might as well give the kid an abacus. You might as well go back to a more primitive form of arithmetic. Ours is an arithmetic system that requires memorization. And they don't teach the kids this in the schools because they no longer believe in it. Well, in my book, I have a good arithmetic program. So you get all three in this one little book. And then I produced Alpha Phonics because I needed a tutoring book that I could use when I was tutoring all of these reading disabled young people and older people. And so I arranged all of this in a very attractive form. If you notice, there are no pictures. I've never had a child ask for pictures. No singing, no dancing, no jumping, no games, just teaching the alphabetic system. You see, I don't insult their intelligence. Because these children taught themselves to speak their own language, all by themselves, without the help of Sesame Street, without the help of puppets jumping out of garbage cans. So, they can learn. Treat them like the intelligent human beings they are, and they learn very nicely. Then I became very curious about how the government, I asked myself, I'm a strong believer in freedom, and I love this country, and I love its ideals and its principles, which were the Founding Fathers' principles, and I asked myself, when did the American people decide to give up responsibility of education and to give it over to the government? Whatever made them do this? It seems like such a ridiculous idea for a free country, for a free people. So I decided to do research on this subject. And I found out that the public school movement in this country was basically started by the Unitarians. Now, why did the Unitarians, the Boston Unitarians, the New England Unitarians were the ones in the forefront of the public school movement? Why? Well, you see, the Unitarians were rebelling against their Calvinist forefathers, you see. And they rejected the divinity of Christ. That's why they call themselves Unitarians as opposed to Trinitarians. They rejected the divinity of Christ, and so they said salvation is no longer attainable through Christ because he was not divine. He was no more divine than any of us. As a matter of fact, they said we're all divine. But they said that since salvation is not achievable through Christ, the only way you can deal with evil is through education. That a good education will, and they decided what were the causes of evil. They said the causes of evil were ignorance, poverty, and social injustice. And they said, well, we'll get rid of ignorance through education. That will get rid of poverty, and poverty will get rid of social injustice. So they said, and only a government system can do that because only a government system can get this Calvinism out of the schools. Because what are the Calvinists teaching? They're teaching people that they're innately depraved. And they believe that man was innately good and that man was morally perfectible. Well, now we've had 150 years of this stuff, and has it worked out? Is man innately good? Is he innately perfectible? Have his morals improved? They said, if we have public schools, we'll get rid of crime. Now we've got crime in the public schools. We've got kids coming to school with guns. We've got murders in schools. We've got drugs in schools. I mean, the corruption of the schools now is so total that it just destroys everything these people stood for. But if you want to know the truth of how they took over and how they were able to fool everybody, why? Because back in those days, none of this had been tested. You see, none of this, everybody said, well, maybe they're right. Maybe man is innately good. Well, let's give it a try. Let's see if it works. Well, here it is 150 years later, and we know it does not work. It doesn't work. So if you want the history of that, and it's a very interesting history because most of it took place in this area. So it'll teach you a great deal about the history of this area and also the religious history of America. Because this is the kind of history you don't get. It's called, Is Public Education Necessary? And You don't get this kind of history in America because, they talk about the wars and inventions and that sort of thing. But our religious history is very important because, you see, the Unitarians took over Harvard very early in the 19th century, and out of Harvard has come all of the poison, you see. That is, and Unitarianism has degraded from Unitarianism into Universalism and then into what was it called back in those days? Then humanism became humanism. The Humanist Manifesto was written by young Unitarian ministers. And now it's become paganism. The Unitarian Church is now a pagan church. You go to their services, and they'll read from, the Koran, they'll read from this, they'll read from that, anything. Anything goes now in the Unitarian Church. And that's what's happened. And Unitarianism also is where you will find the origin of American political liberalism. Because the doctrine of Unitarianism said the only way to salvation is to improve the environment, is to improve the social conditions, is to become politically active, to do social work. That was the Unitarian philosophy. And so they are acting out basically their religion. And this book will explain it to you very nicely. It's my favorite book. Well, this goes up to about 1850. Then I wrote the NEA book in order to bring the story up to date, which deals with the creation of the National Education Association, which became the instrument for the educators to nationalize American education. At their first founding conference, the people who founded the NEA said that their aim is to get a Department of Education with a Secretary of Education. It took a little time. They had to wait until the Carter administration before they got it, but they finally did get it. Their aim was to create a national education system. Now, this book also explains how the progressives came on the scene, the takeover of the education system by the psychologists, the imposition of all of these programs to dumb down the country, and the imposition of the humanist philosophy in education in America. And so what we're seeing today now is really, we're almost at the end of the game. I mean, the job is almost complete. To give you an idea of how far this thing has advanced, and of course Charlotte showed you how this thing's been organized since 1948, was it, when she quoted that Maryland document from Maryland to show you how far back that they've been planning this. Well, one of the most important developments is this data collection that they must have on all of us. You see, in order to control all of us, as they are going to do with the schools, you see, the schools are going to become the community, you see, because every child will be put in the school. Now, in OBE and Goals 2000, the aim is to get hold of the children before they're born. In other words, to start dealing with pregnant women. And as a matter of fact, in my newsletter on Who Controls American Education, I show how this world government clique has been controlling this since the turn of the century, beginning, of course, with Cecil Rhodes. Excuse me. It happens when you talk too fast. Anyway, it goes back. It doesn't sound very good. Anyway, it goes back to Cecil Rhodes and his creation of the secret society for an eventual world government, and the use of the Council on Foreign Relations as the American branch of this world conspiracy. and also of the Carnegie groups, the Carnegie group of foundations, as the go-between and as the initiator of so much of the stuff that is now being used in the schools. For example, it was the Carnegie Corporation that initiated the U.S.-Soviet education exchanges under the Reagan administration. And the latest Carnegie Corporation report deals with the control of your children. And this was just released the other day. The goal one, the first goal of the 8 goals is, how many goals are there? Was it 9, 8? How many? 8, all right. Goal 1 reads, by the year 2000, all children in America will start school ready to learn. Now that sounds very innocuous until you see what they're planning to do with it. Well, this was the report in the, this is the report that came, that was in Education Week, April 13th, just a couple of weeks ago. Calling the birth to 3 span the most critical period in a child's development, but the most neglected by policymakers. An expert panel is proposing a broad blueprint for improvements in education, child and health care, and community services to support young children and their families. In a report scheduled for release this week, a Carnegie Corporation of New York task force highlights compelling research evidence on the importance of the first 3 years of life. So they go down there and they say, this very soon after this report was brought out, they had a meeting in Washington, chaired by Hillary Clinton. This was days later. Hillary Clinton. The report points to data showing that early brain development is far more rapid, extensive, and vulnerable to environmental influences than once thought. You see, when you have your children for the first 5 years, your imprint on your children is so strong that they're having a devil of a time turning them into little humanists, you see. And they're saying, hey, we must get to them before even the parents have a chance to do their work. And so they say this. Recommendations include, increasing the proportion of planned low-risk births requires a national commitment. Planned low-risk birth. To expand access to both prenatal care and a full range of family planning services. Other recommendations include providing, as part of a minimum health care reform package, primary and preventive health care services, immunizations, and preconception, prenatal, and postpartum services. Preconception services? What, are you going to get in your bedroom? Preconception services. Offering home visiting services to all first-time mothers. All first-time mothers with a newborn, and more comprehensive visits to families at risk of poor maternal and child health. Expanding the federal family leave law to cover small firms and to provide leave for 4 to 6 months with partial pay. I'm sure all of these small businesses are going to love that. Channeling substantial amounts of aid to improve child care for children under 3, providing incentives to states to improve child care standards, and bolstering caregiver training, wages, and benefits. Every child carer will be given 3 weeks vacation, I suppose. Expanding federal nutrition programs to serve all eligible women and children, and adapting Headstart to serve poor families with infants and toddlers, etc. Also, they include gun control, abortion, and everything else in this one report. on early childhood care. So here's the Carnegie Corporation comes out with a report. Several days later, there's Hillary Clinton and her entire cabinet are there taking this up. And it says, here's how Education Week of April the 20th reported that meeting. It says, a Carnegie Corporation of New York report sounding the alarm about a quiet crisis facing the nation's youngest children evoked a loud and emotional outpouring of support from top government, business, health, and education officials at a meeting here in Washington last week. Can you imagine a bland Carnegie report evoking a loud and emotional outpouring of support from government bureaucrats? And there's Donna Shalala and Richard Riley and Cisneros and the rest of them. And then no sooner than that meeting is over than the Boston Globe of April 23rd, that's 3 days later, reports Headstart could soon be reaching out to pregnant women, infants, and many more working families 3 decades after it first touched the lives of the nation's poorest preschool children. In a late-night vote Thursday, the Senate agreed to expand and improve the comprehensive early childhood development program now serving about 720,000 children, most of them 3 to 5 years old. The Senate's vote comes a week after the Carnegie Corporation, a New York philanthropy, warned that the nation's infants and toddlers are in trouble and that their healthy development and ultimately the country's economic strength are at risk, unquote. Now I ask you, how many private entities in America can get that kind of attention and action from the White House and the Congress in the course of 1 week? How do you like that? That just shows you where the power is and how all of this is being imposed upon us. There's no discussions anywhere about this. Well, a bunch of government bureaucrats have decided that this is what's going to be for you and me in the future and for your children. I mean, when Riley came out with his report that half the adult population can barely read, that's a crisis. Did that evoke a loud and emotional outpouring of support from our government? Did you hear that? You know what Riley's recommendation was to people with reading problems? He said, why don't you go back to school for a tune-up? That was his recommendation, a tune-up. Americans need a tune-up. So we are being dumbed down in a way that is, it boggles the mind when you think how smoothly this whole thing is working itself out. How these planners, I don't want to use the word conspirators, let's just call them planners, one world planners, have left no stone unturned, have figured out everything to the minutest detail on how to achieve their goal. And most of the American people are in a fog about the whole thing. They have the faintest idea what is happening. And people are waking up in different ways. Some parents are saying, hey, it doesn't make sense to give condoms to kids. I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to protest. I'm going to go to the school board. I'm going to go to the teachers. And then when they're rebuffed by the school board and the teachers, for example, in Lexington, where condoms are now freely given out to all of these intelligent kids, there's a small group of very intelligent conservatives who have particularly one man, Douglas Yo. He plays for the Boston Symphony Orchestra, highly intelligent man. He's written letters with facts showing them that condoms don't work, all of the information that he has channeled all of this to the schools in the naive belief that these people are lacking the facts. That somehow if you just brought to them the truth, the facts, that they would say, oh, gee, we've been wrong. What we've been doing all these years is utterly wrong. And of course, what they do is they rebuff him just as they rebuffed me. I've told them for years that phonics works better than looks say. Where has it gotten me? Whole language. That's what we have, which is worse than looks say. Much worse, because there you have a whole new philosophy of reading which says that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to read inaccurately. It's okay to create your own meaning. As a matter of fact, that's the new definition of reading, is constructing meaning. Constructing meaning. Do I have any more time? Oh. All right, I want to thank you. You've been very kind. Thank you. God bless you.